Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jeff Noakes. I'm the Canadian War Museum's Second World War historian, and I'm very pleased to act as your host today. I am speaking to you today from Ottawa. Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge that our museum is located on the traditional, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I would like to start with a brief orientation to our Zoom webinar features. Today's presentation will be recorded. You will be able to access the recording after the event by visiting the Canadian War Museum's YouTube channel. La présentation d'aujourd'hui sera enregistrée. Vous pourrez la visionner ultérieurement sur la chaîne YouTube du Musée canadien de la guerre. L'événement d'aujourd'hui est présenté en anglais avec une traduction simultanée en français. Pour démarrer l'interprétation simultanée, cliquez sur l'icône du globe terrestre au bas de votre écran, puis choisissez la version française. Vous pouvez régler le volume et l'option de traduction à votre convenance. Following our presentation, there will be a question and answer session. To submit a question for our speaker, please enter it in the Q&A section located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we may not have time to address all the questions. The chat function will not be available for this particular part of the event. Finally, before we begin the event, I would like to note that Vera volunteers her time to share her personal experience of the Holocaust with all of us, and this can be emotionally difficult. Even though we cannot all see one another, I trust that we are all joined together in the spirit of tolerance, openness, and learning. Please ensure that all questions are thoughtful and in that spirit. I'd also like to note that this event was made possible because of our partnership with the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. I would now like to pass the virtual microphone over to Elena Kingsbury, who will tell you a bit more about their incredible organization and introduce you to today's guest of honor, Vera Schiff.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you so much to the War Museum for partnering with us today. Let me just share my screen so that I can make sure. Oh. Okay, so sorry about that. I just wanted to get my slides up here. Are we able to see?
I can see from here, but I don't know about the students.
Okay, well, we'll assume that we can in that case. All right, I'm so sorry for the interruption. Now, as I said, I did want to first just start by saying thank you so much to the War Museum for partnering with FSWC today. The Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies is a Canadian nonprofit organization that seeks to counter anti-Semitism, racism, and other forms of prejudice through education and advocacy to help build a more inclusive future for Canadians and people everywhere. Each of our programs is guided by our namesake, Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal was a Nazi hunter after World War II ended. He also himself survived the Holocaust, and he really recognized the importance of, first of all, bringing justice to victims of the Holocaust by making sure that those that committed those crimes were prosecuted. And then also he focused a lot on the importance of education as the best way forward and the best tool that we have to foster empathy and avoid repeating the crimes of history. And so I just want to use these two photos here to introduce you to Vera Schiff today. Vera is, as I mentioned earlier, she's somebody who lived through the Holocaust, and she was only 12 years old when the Nazis invaded her homeland, Czechoslovakia, in 1938. In this event, the invasion of Czechoslovakia actually helped set the stage for the Second World War itself and the Nazi domination of Europe. Before we begin the conversation between Vera and historian Jeff, I just wanted to provide you with a few key background details about Vera's life and how it changed during the war. Vera was born on May 17th in 1926 in Prague, which is the Czech Republic's capital city. Today, Czechoslovakia has been separated into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. at Vera's time, it was Czechoslovakia. And this life that she lived when she was a young child was in many ways a really beautiful life. She lived with her mother, her father, and her older sister, Eva. And so you can see in this photo right here, we have Vera on the left and her older sister, Eva, on the right. And Vera's father was a lawyer who worked for the civil service. They lived a comfortable middle-class life. And in many ways, Vera remembers her childhood as a really beautiful time. Unfortunately, a lot of that changed when her country was invaded in 1938. And this event actually really sparked off the war itself in many ways, because it was after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, shortly thereafter, that Poland was invaded. And basically, that was the event that actually started World War II itself. Okay. And just so we understand as well what we're talking about today, the Holocaust is a time period, and these are just a couple of pictures of Vera's homeland during the war. And basically, the Holocaust is this time period that we give the name to when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime from Germany began to target Jewish people, not just within Germany, but actually all over Europe. And so keep that in mind as we're hearing more about Vera's story, that she didn't live in Germany. She was from a community outside of Germany. And that's a reality to keep in mind, that many people who were victims of the Nazi regime, came from countries outside of Germany itself. Okay. And I would also just like to let you know a little bit more about Vera's family during the Holocaust and what happened. During the Holocaust, Vera and her family, once the Nazis had invaded Czechoslovakia, increasingly anti-Jewish laws were put in place, kind of progressively worse and worse. Finally, in 1942, in May of that year, Vera and her family were sent to a concentration camp called Theresienstadt. And this was actually a transit camp that was located within Czechoslovakia. But this camp was basically a waiting point for many Jewish people that were then sent on further to the east, sent to camps including Auschwitz. And most of those people lost their lives when they were sent further east. And so really Vera's story during the Holocaust is a story of her struggling to survive and struggling to avoid being deported further east. And unfortunately, during this struggle to survive, Vera was the only person in her family that actually survived. And so her sister passed away first a few months after entering the camp. And shortly thereafter, both of her parents also passed away. And this tragedy, rather than destroy Vera, Vera managed to endure in spite of that and survived this horrible atrocity, and survived until liberation by one of the Allied armies in 1945, again in May of 1945. And so Vera, after the war, immigrated to Canada in 1960, and she married a fellow survivor from Theresienstadt named Vera Schiff, and had a beautiful life together, which they made for themselves in Canada with their 2 sons. And at this point, I'm going to turn the podium back over to Jeff and Vera to have a conversation now, where we're going to hear about Vera's insights into World War II, specifically through her perspective of somebody who lived through that time. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, thank you. And thank you, Elena. And thank you again, Vera, for joining us today. It's truly an honor to have you with us today for this conversation. So I guess, well, what we could start with perhaps is whether you can tell us a bit about your life in Prague before the war, before these events began unfolding.
Well, first, let me tell you, thank you for inviting me and having me. And I'm glad to meet so many students. Unfortunately, I cannot see you, which I would love to, but we have got to do what we can have. My life in Czechoslovakia before the Nazis invasion was really a happy one. I do have, yeah, I was born between the two world wars, World War I and World War II. And these 20 years, the Czechoslovak Republic, which was built on the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, giving self-determination to small nations, was the constitution was tailored according to the French example, which offered equality, equal rights to all minorities. And I want you to know that we Jews were only one of the tiny minorities. The Republic had many minorities, and they hoped that cooperation and by having enthusiasm for a new democratic country, the country will prosper, which it really did. And it would have likely continued if not for the violence which came from Germany, which was, we were actually the first non-German speaking country which was occupied by the Nazis, because people at that point had hardly idea that really Nazis were not only trying to on the expansion in Europe, but there was a World War movement really to change the world. But we didn't know it then. So my years before the invasion were a happy one. My father was a lawyer in the employ of the government. We went to school, my sister and I. We had private lessons of all kind of additional knowledge after hours. And I remember that it was I do not remember ever having been aware that as a Jew I should feel somehow different. And because my father was in the public service, so I have kind of thought that we all are equal, and that firm belief stayed with me in spite of all these ups and downs of my life, that I do believe that we all are equal. So maybe it gives you the idea of my short young years, but they were happy, they were comfortable, and the shock arrived, of course, 1939, March 15th, when the Nazi army entered the country without a shot, occupying it and splitting it into two entities, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia on the west, on the east, that was the Slovakia. And from then on, the situation changed by the minute by implementing the Nuremberg racial laws, which of course were already valid in Germany and Austria, countries the Nazis already had under their rule. So my childhood actually came to an end by that occupation, and within days, everything changed. It wasn't anymore the same country or the same life as we have never before, but it never returned to it thereafter.
Okay, well, thank you. Can you tell us then, you've just been talking about the arrival of the Germans and how life changed at that point. Could you tell us a little bit about how things went from this pre-war life to 1942, when you and your family were sent to the camp?
Well, you know, the changes became instantaneous. My father was kicked out of his office within days without any recompense. And the Jewish clinics, Jewish offices, everything was ordered to close down and wind down. They have been gradually deprived of all we really owned. But first of all, we were forbidden to use public transit. And in Prague, everything moved in buses or streetcars. So we allowed to use the last car between 4 and 5 only. The same 4 and 5 magic hour was dedicated. You could shop, but not all stores would deal with Jews. And gradually the Nazis issued order after an order to bring to the police station our valuables, electric appliances, whatever they wanted, we had to bring in there. And we, of course, never saw any of it back any time. And the problem was that we have been under a lot of restrictions of movement. We couldn't, curfew called us 7 o'clock in the evening to be at home. But my father, because he had so many friends in public service, had friends who would come, of course, secretly, knock on our door and tell us more about the news, what's going on in the world, because at that point we didn't have a radio or newspaper anymore. And some of them were trying to be well helpful. And the fact actually that I'm sitting here and talking with you, I owe to a Gentile friend of my father who saved our life. He saved my life. He couldn't save his, but that's for later time. So I'm saying that at that point, we were the pariahs of the Czech society, but we did have assistance and help by a whole lot of friends of my father who did not turn their back on us just because the Nazis told them to do so. But it was a little struggle to make ends meet because everything was taken away from us. So we, of course, tried to barter whatever we had on valuables, but it lasted long. And if you do not have income, but you have expenses, so it was really quite a bit of a struggle. I want to add at this point that we have tried desperately to get out of Europe, but not only, of course, us. I don't know any Jewish family who wouldn't have attempted. And we did try to get to Curacao, where my aunt was coming from. And Irma Gersel, she was born in Curacao. We were trying to get out, my mother registered my sister and I for the kinder transport. We were trying to get through a friend of my mother, Mrs. Mahati, whose son was a movie producer in Hollywood. We were tried so many things and everything ended up in a failure. But again, I want to say that we were not unique. Unfortunately, most of us got trapped, and when the war broke out, which was September 1st, 1939, all passports were cancelled and all attempts and efforts to leave Europe were mixed. So from then on, we were just sitting ducks waiting for the, the disaster to come down, which it very quickly did. So this was this time from the occupation to the beginning of the deportation of Jews from Prague, which in between, of course, all Jewish children were expelled from schools. We had to wear the Jewish star, the yellow patch of cloth, which had inside the inscription, the word Jude, which stands in German for Jew. And believe it or not, that was a very difficult moment for me, then a fearless, spunky kid, to go to street with that, because I was afraid that somebody could hit me. And I was awaiting that violence because I knew that the Germans provoked the population in hatred to us. But I have to say that I was never violated or attacked by anybody. But the fear already was here, the change of anticipation what the day will bring and how to protect yourself against potential harm. So these were very troublesome times because not only we couldn't go to school, we were expelled from by the German order, of course, but we could go to parks and no swimming pools, no skating rinks. Everything was off limits for Jews. And of course, the early evening curfew. So it was, my father tried desperately to teach my sister and I some of the high school material, but that was really attempt to really, couldn't really fill normal life. But he tries very hard to keep us develop educational at least.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess I should ask then as the obvious next question, or an obvious next question. So when were you and your family arrested or picked up and then taken to Theresienstadt?
We went, the deportation of Jews from Prague started 41, and then they went to through transport to the Polish ghetto Wiesenthal, which was overcrowded and filled with contagious diseases. So the Germans decided that they need transit camps, and they had established one in the Protectorate, which was Theresienstadt. Then they had one in Reims in France. They had one in Westerbork in Holland. The reason being that the war was, at that point, the Germans were locked in a military conflict with the Soviet Union. The trains supplying the men in uniform, the German men in uniform, were needed by the Wehrmacht so that they couldn't transport the Jews at their liberties and planning the way they would want to. So the Germans conceived an idea to bring Jews into transit camps, have them there accumulated at a convenient time, ship them to the east. And we knew that we are going to be resettled to the east, and that east never had a name because there were never really any name existing. And we did have some very dark fears because rumors had it that there are no camps, that what's awaiting us in east is really death. But, I want to suggest to you that if you sit in that hopeless situation, the last thing which dies is hope. You keep on hoping against hope. And we always thought that tomorrow will bring some reprieve or something, improve our condition. It did not, but as I keep on, this is a human perception if you find yourself in such dire conditions. So the choice on a transit camp in Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia fell on Theresienstadt, which was a fortress built in 18th century by Emperor Joseph II. and served 100 years as a fortress to stave off the aggression from the north. As none happened, 100 years later, it was converted to a garrison town, and further 100 years later, it was converted into a transit concentration camp. Theresienstadt really was not only transit camp, it became a concentration camp. It was a very different camp than most of the German concentration camp because it served several purposes. It served purposes that the Germans brought their Jewish war veterans who were wounded in First World War. They brought the Jewish famous whose names was who is who in European scenery then. They brought their people who were once affluent, or who were, and they kept these people in Theresienstadt usually for a few weeks, awaiting the outcry of the world at large. And as the outcry never came, they were eventually all shipped to the east, and in the east was then that we know, the death by gas or shooting or whatever camp the people went to. So our turn to be deported came in May 1942. We were instructed to come with 50 kilograms of basic items to the site of deportation, which was in Prague, in a place where the exhibitions were held. There were railway station where we were put on trains, and 2 hours later, the train arrived in Theresienstadt. But I should have said that before our deportation, that friend of my father, who I keep on coming back because he saved my life, and he was instrumental in my family died in Theresienstadt. And you may not perceive it as such a blessing, but for me to know that my parents died what's called not natural death by illness and malnutrition, not choked by toxic gas. Till today, I find it comforting that they did not go through that very last horrible station so many Jews had to go through, namely death by carbon monoxide or Cyclone B, which unfolded in that east. So I think that this is what is our preparations and our getting ready. And we had a big hope that this friend of my father will come through, which he did, and that we perhaps will be spared the deportation to the east, which we didn't really know exactly what it is, but we knew that it will be bad. So this was our and once we have arrived there, we were put into the stables, which were once for the cavalry. And 2 days later, the transport was ordered on train again, and we were exempted. By that we, I mean my parents, sister and I. The rest, 5,000 people, ended 2 days later in death camp called Malý Trostinec, which was a death camp in Belarus, where they died murdered by carbon monoxide. All this I have, of course, learned after the war. While we were there, I didn't know any of it. We remained in Theresienstadt and were ordered to march into the camp proper, where my father was sent to men's barracks, and my mother, sister, and I to women barracks. The women barracks had a 3-tier bunks, whereas the men barracks had nothing. So the men were sitting on the floor. There were really nothing there to soften their stay there. This was also early. Theresienstadt existed just from the fall 1941 as a camp. And this is where we started our life as inmates, which for my sister was a short one, and for me, a rather long one. So if you want me to tell you something more about that, I would be happy to do that.
I think that would be, I think people would be interested. I certainly would be interested to learn more about life at Theresienstadt.
Well, for an inmate, it was very simple. All inmates had to work. Some of them had to a very backbreaking work because they are nearby coal mines. There were German war industry brought to vicinity of the camp, but we, the inmates, had to work it endless hours and terrible conditions. But people who work for the German war industry were at times protected from deportation to the east. In my family, my parents, they were in their 40s, they were considered old, so they were assigned to clean. And my sister she got a club commando as a worker in a field where the Germans grew for themselves fruit and vegetables. That was also a lot of pulling strings by the friend of my father, who never lost his focus on us, trying to help us to survive this terrible period in life of any family. And for myself, I was working the infrastructure in the hospital. The place had a military hospital because before it was the garrison town. And now the hospital was still called hospital, but we didn't have any medication or any injections or anything what medication, what hospitals do have. But it was kind of penultimate station before death, where patient came and never really had discharged. I don't remember that anybody would have improved or been able to return to the camp. So this was a working situation for us. And in Theresienstadt, I think the worst I remember, well, the worst for myself was the fear of the deportation, which was ongoing. And with every passing day, we have heard more details, one worse than the other, what unfolds in that East. So of course, you know, we didn't believe it maybe all, because we tried to believe that it may not that bad, but we knew it would be very bad. And in Theresienstadt itself was bad, because not only was this fear of being sent further up to the east, but we were having a terrible starvation there. And I want people to know that this lack of food with which the inmates were treated, and you might have seen some of those pictures of the liberated 45 inmates, really skeletons of human beings. That was not really that the Germans couldn't give us a slice of bread more or a ladle of soup. That was another weapon how to kill us. Starvation was a matter of killing us, and the starvation, of course, killed in Theresienstadt its existence as a camp where some close to 40,000 people died of subhuman living conditions, which is the starvation, and of course the jamming and packing of people, which had a potential of 5,000 people at any one time, 50, 60,000 Jews jammed into it. Eventually, that was not only Czech Jews, there were people from Holland, Germany, Austria, Greece, wherever the Germans found it convenient to deport people to Theresienstadt. And of course, there was no possibility to offer in this very small fortress, which was surrounded by thick walls. You know, there was no place to expand anything. So it was a jam place where that crowding triggered, of course, infectious diseases, because to talk of hygiene is, you know, in such places, in such crowding, impossible. So we had tuberculosis was pandemic, and we had of course, cholera, dysentery. So that's why these thousands of people died because of the gas chambers of Theresienstadt, which you might find if you were to visit today. They were never activated. They were built at the end of the 45 with the idea that to kill the still remaining inmates, but they were never put into action because the last commandant made a deal and fled before the Russian army liberated the camp. So to summarize it is, the worst was the anxiety of the impending death in the East, which we knew was coming our way, we couldn't avert. The starvation, which was, if you are that starved, your mindset really changes substantially. And then the crowding and the continuous diseases where you couldn't find relief and reprieve. So these were the hardships of the Theresienstadt, which in the long run caused this high mortality. So in our family, the first to die was my grandmother, who actually lost consciousness on the train already. And then my athletic, energetic sister contracted some infection, which were prevalent. We all had ongoing infections. But somehow her infection her system couldn't cope with it. And so after 3 months lingering, and at that point we have tried to do anything and everything to exchange what we still had hidden to bring some drugs or medication in, but all was in vain. So we have lost her 3 months later, and that was, of course, the last my parents could absorb on emotional shocks and insults. So my father died not long thereafter, and I want you to know that he really, for him, the man who lived for his intellectual pursuit and that life in camp was something which he really never somehow could have found a niche where he could have fit in it. And the longest living relative of mine was my mom, who was the ultimate fighter, but she succumbed to tuberculosis, which we all had a degree, because it depends when and how you were affected by it. So by 1946, for 46, for 1943, I was there all alone because everybody had died. And my relatives, I had a large family in Prague. They were deported after us, and some went through Theresienstadt, but most went directly to the east. And after the war, I found out where they died, what had happened, and nobody had returned. And I want you to know that this is not so, it's very easy to really find out, because you may not believe it, but the Germans were quite proud of their action to kill the lower race, the Jews, because you can find archives, even about us, you can find them now, where I can find the names of my uncles and cousins and all of them, and I find out where their last days were spent. So, it was a painful journey to piece it together. And unfortunately, I'm the sole survivor of a large family. And the reason I want the world to know is that it's up to you to create a better world than we have been born into. Although, as I said, the first 20 years between the wars looked very promising in Czechoslovakia. And I'm sorry that it never really worked out as we hoped it would.
I think you've touched on this a little bit before, but while you were in Theresienstadt, how aware were you of the war itself? So the broader events that were taking place outside of where you were you aware of them at all to any degree?
Well, we were aware that the war was on, because the war was on, broke out September 1st, 1939. We were still in Prague. The German invasion into Russia we were still then in Prague. And from history that initially the Germans scored with their blitzkrieg one victory after another, which was enormously discouraging to us, because our only hope on life was that they will lose the war, which ultimately they did. But many months or years, it didn't look like it. The first sign of opposition to their mighty Wehrmacht was close to Moscow and Stalingrad. Before that, the German army conquered Poland and Western Europe, and they walked virtually through as if wouldn't have been resistant at all. And the only time when it came to an end was when the Russian winter came down. Not only did it stop once Napoleon, but it now stopped the Wehrmacht. And from then on, the Russians very slowly began to push backward. But we in camp had no idea what was going on. Nobody spoke with us. We were ordered into the commandos where we worked. The camp was guarded by armed German forces who were assisted by 150 Czech gendarmes who were not armed, but they were, of course, assisting Germans in guarding the camp. So these people were screened for their hostile feelings towards Jews, but some of them were willing to, if you had, like we had hidden some gold shoulder pads, and then my sister ailed, we took it out and wanted to exchange it for drugs. So some of the gendarmes would be willing to deal. It was enormously risky for them too, because Germans would have been shot them too. But greed is a powerful emotion too. But you were totally at the mercy of the person to whom you gave maybe a bracelet asking for a drug. If he brought it next day, you were lucky. If he didn't, and whatever he brought, you had no control. We were so helplessly delivered at the mercy of those who guarded us, or everybody had more power than we had. So this was an idea how the war proceeds. We had no concrete idea. But we did know that upon the end of the 45, 44, 45, when the Germans suddenly ordered on the frozen highways of Europe people who were in camps in Poland, in Ukraine, when the Russian army approached and Germans couldn't kill all of them, so they forced them to march to Theresienstadt. And these were the death camps. And the death marchers came to Theresienstadt. And this way we knew that something in the East is going bad for the Germans, but the extent how the war is unfolding, and if there's a chance for anybody to survive, because we did know the Germans will not leave behind witnesses. We knew that they have liquidated the camps in the East. As the Russian army was approaching, nobody was left for the Russians to meet them. So we really didn't hope that we had a chance. But I keep on telling you, we keep on thinking that tomorrow will bring some ray of sun or some kind of something to your life which will enable you to make it. And obviously, in my case, I did.
Thank you. I think a question that's probably going to come to mind for a lot of people, and certainly for me, after hearing you sharing your experiences with us, is what lessons from the Second World War do you think are still relevant today, 75 years on from these events?
Well, you know, I think that some of the lessons are immortal, to last, and I say should last, I hope, for humanity. First off, that there are no superior races, or that there are, the Germans start themselves as the Aryans, the blue-eyed, blonde German is a race above. Well, this is the lesson number 2. There are no races above, and we all are equal. And I hope this is a message which is relevant today as it was then. And I hope today we do understand that we are all equal. But I hope it's needed to stress it, that we should treat one another with respect and consideration. So this is relevant from then, that we should create a better world. And we also should learn that violence does not really solve any problems. I want to submit to the thought that 1945, when the war came to an end, the crushing end, nothing has been solved. Europe lay in dust and shards. Many cities had to be rebuilt. 6 million Jews were dead. Among them, we lost 1 million children. Who benefited? War and violence never solved the problems. I think the lesson number 2 is do not solve problems by violence. As the first president of Czechoslovak Republic, Masaryk, was teaching Czechs, democracy is an exchange of ideas. You may not agree with my ideas, but we should be able to sit and talk it out and modify and respect one another, not impose one philosophy on the other. So I think this is a lesson which people should appropriate today as well. It's very important in our highly divided world or polarized world that we should find common language. And if not, today even more so than then, because today we have weapons of mass destruction at our fingertips, you know, that we 45 didn't have it, luckily, but you know, today we do. So we have to learn to interact with respect, consideration, understanding, and being able to run a conversation in which we share our concerns, but work out a solution which answers both sides' needs. And the answer is not in violence. So I think these are the, they are of course lesser important items, but these are the larger items which people should bear in mind when they want to learn what these needless bloodsheds brought to mankind. And we should learn from that never to inflict it on one another again if we want to create a better world. There are better ways how to get ahead and develop than to try to use weapons and destroy life. So I think this would be what I would think. And that's why I say I do come and talk to students. Do not ever try to use any other, but intellectual means how to reach an agreement. There are always points on which we may disagree. This is a democracy. You may have different ideas than I do, but we should be able to exchange them in a civilized, intelligent way and come to a creative conclusion.
Thank you. I mean, for sharing all of this with us, and especially the lessons you think that are still relevant today, some 75 years on after these events that have happened. So we're going to coordinate now for some questions. And I think Elena is going to be asking, yes.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you so much, Vera. I feel like I learn more every time I hear you speak, and there was so much, just insight that you provided in the answers that you just provided. We have also gotten a number of questions from students and other viewers as you've been speaking, but I'm actually going to start with, we got a couple of really amazing questions from a school in Sioux Lookout before the program even started. They came prepared with some questions for you. And so the question that I'd like to just start with, and again, this is coming from Sacred Heart School in Sioux Lookout, was how did you actually deal with separation from your family and the deaths of your family while you were in a concentration camp? How did you go on? How did you deal with that emotionally?
Well, that's an excellent question. That was one of the big heartbreaks. First of all, the family got broken up and my relatives went to Poland. But, the separation, the ailing and the ultimate death of my relatives, that was the worst, which of course affected all my life. I'm one out of 50 family members who survived that terrible tragedy. And to mourn 50 people all your life is a very heavy burden. But in their names, in the hope that their memory can be honored to help to create a more tolerant world where all this will be perceived as impossible to happen again. In their honor, I would hope that we can absorb this lesson. And it was extremely difficult to carry on, especially in 1945, when I eventually realized that nobody will come back, because originally I knew that my immediate family, they died in Theresienstadt. But when they realized that nobody from the East will come back, and I realized how they died, it was a very bad shock. But the handful of survivors, most of us had to deal with that. And it was a very difficult time, because at that point we were supposed to somehow pick up the pieces. But you have to understand that we have lost our families. We didn't have any means because all our assets were stolen from us. So we were penniless. We didn't have a skill how to make living. We were kicked out of schools as children, and we were as teenagers coming out, half dead or very sick, and now we were expected to cope with life. So I want you to know these were very difficult years. So the question of the students, how I did it, my answer would be, it was very difficult. But thanks for asking, because people should know that such loss is not only a heartbreak, it has got lifelong crippling existence on your life.
Absolutely. And I think that makes it all the more amazing that you have such a beautiful perspective on humanity and on the potential that we do have to do better in the future. Another student question. So first of all, do you have a tattoo? Is one question coming from Janet Sheehan. Do you have a tattoo? We sometimes see in movies or things like that the survivors from camps have a tattoo. So what about for you?
No, the tattoo was done in one camp, which was a hybrid camp between a death camp and a working camp. It was Auschwitz-Birkenau. The people who got tattoo in Auschwitz, when they arrived, they went through selection. Those who went to judged were not useful, they tend to gas, so these were not tattooed. But those who were strong enough that they might deliver a pound of flesh for the German war machine, they were had a tattooed number, because this way they couldn't escape and they were registered. As it is said, Germans knew that they will kill every one of them. In Theresienstadt, that was perceived as transit camp, or concentration camp, no tattoo was ever made. So the only place where they had done it, I think they might have done it in Majdanek some too, but mostly it was in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And believe it or not, those who were tattooed were the lucky ones, because they were the ones who passed the selection and were doomed fit enough to work. Whereas those who were fit too young or too old or too sickly looking, they had to die. I hope you comprehend the absurdity of that, that people were having done nothing but being just maybe not strong enough, were deemed useless specimen. So the absurdity of that I hope you should take into your heart. And this is carry for future in you, so that there are no people who are, even if they are sick, everybody is useful. There are no useless people. So that's for the tattoo.
Excellent. And that's a very important message. Yes. So there were no tattoos given at Theresienstadt, and that was something that was primarily at Auschwitz, which I think a lot of us, that's the camp that we hear most about. But part of the value of your story is realizing that there are a lot of different experiences in a lot of different camps. So that's really important to know. Thank you. So another question that a student has asked is, first of all, what did you actually feel on the day of liberation? So how did you feel? And maybe also, how were you treated by the soldiers that liberated you? What was that experience like?
Well, the liberation came to Theresienstadt on May 8, 1945. And believe it or not, because we were sitting in the fortress, we had no idea. But the outside were some motorized unit passing outside those thick walls. So some of us took courage and to sneak between the holes in the walls. And there were the tanks which were approaching. We didn't know whose tanks they were. But when they came near, we have seen that they had on the turrets marked sickle and hammer, which was, of course, we knew the insignia of Soviet Union. At that point, I cannot, I always search for proper words to dress it, to describe the emotion, and I have never found them, because you cannot imagine that you zigzag between death and horrible life for so many years, barely hoping that there is a tomorrow, and all of a sudden, for no anything, you see the liberators. All of a sudden, we saw those young chaps coming from the turrets of the tanks, smiling, and we knew that this is the evil has been broken. And I still cannot tell you if it was something like exhilaration, gratitude, believe in miracle. I don't know how kind of mixture, but I know that the few of us who stood there watching it, some cried, some fell on the ground. It is a feeling you cannot duplicate, because hopefully, because we cannot have these experiences. Eventually, of course, after when we had to return back to the camp, which was infested with illnesses, and the only productive part of camp were the very many lice, because everybody else wasn't dying and hungry and finished. But those of us who lived through that day, it was for us, it was a miracle which we didn't dare to hope, and yet it unfolded in front of our eyes. So that moment is beyond description, between thanking God, believing that there are miracles, and of course the underlying despair. I have nobody to go and run and share to my mother, listen, the war is over.
Yeah.
It was a very complex emotion, but what follows was even more complicated. But that very moment, I don't know if the Russian soldiers, they were trying to throw us from the tanks bread, because we knew we were looking the part, the starved inmates. And at that point, we were so mesmerized that here the boys, the liberators are here, that even bread, which under normal circumstances was enormously appreciated, at that moment, the presence of the liberators was what matters. And I still remember the smiling faces of those young boys. And I don't know what they thought of us, but to us, that was a moment which I will never, to my last moment, forget. But I cannot dress it properly in words.
Oh, no, I can understand. And I think you've captured it very well, that it's, the sort of, the complexity of the emotion, the sort of elation, but also, especially over the days and weeks as you sort of come to terms with the losses, that becomes very difficult. And so I think we just have time for one last question. And I think I would like to just end by asking you about when you came to Canada, what was your experience like? And what actually made you come to Canada? Because you were from Czechoslovakia. What was your journey to Canada after the war ended?
Well, after the war, I married in Theresienstadt. I met my husband in Theresienstadt. And after the war, we have tried to recapture a home in Prague. And we did really believe that we were the Czechs of Jewish religion. Jews lived in this part of the world in 10th century. The Czech Jews were greatly devoted to Republican patriots. So we did hope 45 that we might perhaps find a way how to restore our lives. It proves that it cannot be, because first of all, we were too deeply wounded from the war experiences. You cannot live in a city. When I was passing by the buildings, and every single one of them, this cousin lived or that uncle, all were dead. So it's like living in a cemetery. I couldn't do it. And on top of all, but of course, we have tried hectically to fill some education and get some professional abilities to make our lives viable. But in 1948, the Czechoslovak government underwent a communist coup d'etat. And at that point, the family of my husband fled to West. And Arthur and I, my husband and I, we remained behind. But 1949, we have left. And the family of my husband went to Canada. And upon the family reunification, the Canadian government has their provisions that your family can be reunited. At least it was then. So at least this way we came in the 1960s to Canada. And I want you to know that I'm very grateful to Canada, that it was a wonderful country, and that we should know how lucky we are that where we live under the conditions we have, and we should redouble our energies to keep it and pass it on to the next generation, because I have had experiences with different systems of government. And I keep on telling you, as a conclusion, we are very fortunate that we live in a country like Canada, governed by rule of law, democratic country, and such a wonderful country. And I would like to thank you for listening so patiently to what I had to tell you. I would tell you much more if I had time, but I wrote books which you can find in libraries about my stay in camp. I think Simon Wiesenthal Library has my books too.
Yes, we do.
You can email questions to Elena, and you can forward it to me, and I can answer these questions in an email form, because it's impossible in such a short time to concentrate it in what I all would like to tell you, to prepare you for a better life, and hopefully for life without conflicts, to learn from our experiences. So thanks again for coming or listening, and keep in touch.
Thank you, Vera. Vera, I actually just have one last question, and I think that this is such a good question to end on, because, for you to be willing to speak with us today, to, get on the Zoom platform and keep speaking, even though we're dealing with this pandemic, what is it that caused you to want to start sharing your story? When did you realize how important your story is? And I think, we can all agree here that it's invaluable to us as young people looking towards the future. When did you start? Yeah.
I started to talk, I firmly believe that the Holocaust is a historically proven and demonstrated tragedy, which has been documented in photography and many books, till I did not coincidentally run into Holocaust denier, certain Mr. Zundel, who was tried in University Avenue courtroom, and I was there as a court interpreter. And he was then insisting that Holocaust did not happen, and if you Jews died, well, it was the war after all. And I was listening. I was not a court interpreter in his case, but I was there coincidentally. And I couldn't believe it that in the 90s in Canada, somebody would raise an its looked into who it was. So Mr. Zundel was a German national who lived in Canada, who flooded the public with pamphlets and flyers telling them that Holocaust really didn't happen. And this is all Jewish inventions, because Jews are trying to get some money from Germany as a restitution. And having listened to all that, I was really shocked. Took me a while to recover from it. And then I said to my husband, we, the survivors, didn't really do all we had, because the world seems to be ignorant. They keep on denying what I have lived my life, where I have lost my entire family. That didn't happen. So from then on, I devoted my life to talk about it, to write books about it, and lecture about it, because I think the world should know the truth. And not with passage of time, the memory do fade, and soon there will be nobody from actual survivors around. So this should not be allowed to happen, that it should be used and distorted around. that it didn't happen because these people who had the Holocaust deniers, they have their own agenda. And you have to know the agenda. It's not nothing which is ethical or truthful, but people believe if there's some kind of remote experience from times bygone. So please do not believe these things. Write correct books and educate yourself. It's a very important part of human history, how they should create a better world.
Thank you so much. And I think that's absolutely the message that we need to hold with us and keep moving forward with, that, you know, especially when we have people sharing the truth like you're so willing to do, we need to hold on to those lessons and make sure that we are upholding that truth in the future. So I want to just say thank you so much to everybody that's joined us today. You know, thank you on behalf of both the Canadian War Museum and the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies, and particularly a huge thank you to Vera. It's always a pleasure, and I know that we all got a lot out of this experience today. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. And as you may have noticed, my email is in the chat, so if you have any follow-up questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me directly. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and hopefully hear from you. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.